Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I review the Konica IIIa, which is arguably one of the best fixed lens 35mm rangefinder cameras ever created. It was introduced in 1958 and positioned as a direct competitor to the Leica M3, which had only been released 4 years earlier. In contrast to the interchangeable lenses of the Leica M3, this here came with a fixed lens, either a 50mm f1.8 Hexanon lens or a 48mm f2 Hexanon lens that was created for the domestic market primarily. Furthermore, the camera comes with an excellent build quality, a really smooth mechanical operation, and most importantly, a viewfinder magnification of 1.0, so even larger than the Leica M3, which is legendary for its very large and nice viewfinder. But this one here is even larger and nicer. The lenses also were produced to perform on par with the 50mm Summicron, the benchmark lens at the time. And you can really see how Konica tried in all sorts of ways to live up to the Leica M3 and create a viable yet less expensive alternative. And speaking of the price, I purchased this particular camera here from a Japanese dealer for 270 euros, so a little bit of a premium price. There are less expensive versions that you can buy, but as always in such cases I went for condition over price and chose a more expensive one that came in a really nice and great condition. And the main point here is, if you are a 50mm shooter like myself and you don't want to break the bank and don't need an interchangeable lens system, then the Konica IIIa is very interesting in terms of a 35mm rangefinder setup, and we will dig deeper into that. I took the camera with me to a recent trip to Berlin, shooting some Ilford Delta 100, and on my way back we passed Dessau and took a quick stop in order to take some photographs of the Bauhaus master houses there, also on Ilford Delta 100, and in addition to that I took some street shots here in my hometown Munich and at a nearby lake, shooting some Kodak Gold 200 to also see how the lens would perform shooting color. So as always, let's take a closer look at the camera, its features, and most importantly the images it produces, and get a better understanding of my personal impressions as well. The name Konica comes from the combination of the manufacturer's name, Konishiroku, and the suffix CA for camera. So very similar to Leica, referring to Light's camera originally. Konishiroku is one of the oldest Japanese camera companies and originally started as an importer, but already created its own cameras in 1882. And only much later the manufacturer's name was changed to Konica, and this is also why you can still see the original name Konishiroku here written around the lens, for instance. The basic idea of this camera was simple. By leaving out the option to change lenses, it was possible to perfectly tune the entire camera to the fixed lens that it was attached to and create a high quality rangefinder camera for a quarter of the price that a Leica would cost. The Konica IIIa and IIIm, its sister camera, mark the end point of a series of Konica cameras produced after World War II in occupied Japan. And all these Konica cameras are 35mm fixed lens leaf shutter rangefinders, but the IIIa is arguably the finest in the series. And Malcolm X famously owned one of these and used it to photograph Cassius Clay, the boxer that became famous as Muhammad Ali. The camera came in two different versions. A domestic one sold in Japan, which came with a 48mm f2 Hexanon lens with a Seikosha MXL shutter, and the export version, which I have here, which came with a 50mm f1.8 and also a Seikosha MXL shutter. While both models used a coded 6-element lens design based on the Zeiss planar, the 48mm is a bit more compact, but allegedly the shutter is more difficult to fix if it breaks. And in comparison, the 50mm is considered sharper and its shutter is easier to fix. The Seikosha shutters offer speeds from 1 second to 1/500th of a second and feature both an M and X flash sync mode. As is common for leaf shutters, the flash syncs, of course, across all speeds. The 48mm version weighs 800 grams and this one here is 20 grams heavier. A special feature of only the Konica IIIa and IIIm is the double-stroke trigger wind at the front of the camera, similar to that of the Zeiss Tenax 2 or Adox 300. Instead of the usual film advance on the top, you press this lever down with your left hand at the front with 2 strokes to first cock the shutter and transport the film, and then only transport the film. And interestingly, the IIIm offers a half-frame insert that lets you shoot half frames, which in part is only possible because of this 2-step film advance here. And the double-stroke mechanism here, of course, also reminded me of the original Leica M3, which also came with the double-stroke mechanism. The camera's best feature, arguably, is the very large, bright 1:1 viewfinder. With a warmer toned rangefinder patch here in the center, and it not only features the parallax compensation, but was the first camera ever with a continuous field size correction. Like that, the frame lines always represent exactly what will be in your final frame. The front of the camera offers another special feature, and that is the camera works with EV values and thus ties shutter speed and aperture values together. So you have a dedicated EV value ring here with the typical values like 14, 11, 12 and so on. And these create a combination of accurate exposure for shutter speed and aperture. And because of that, it's very difficult to shoot such a camera with the traditional Sunny 16 rule. So if you would want to use it without a light meter, that is a bit difficult and takes a bit more practice. So I would recommend to just go for a external handheld meter or something that you can just put on top of it. So either you go old school and just have a Gossen 16, for instance, that already features EV values, or like I did here, you go for a much more modern version like the Hideko here, but there are also alternatives out there that also supports EV values. And of course, that's really, really interesting because it basically matches the camera perfectly, is not really intrusive or unobtrusive rather. And you can just put it on top of it, set the EV value, put it into your lens, and then select which kind of aperture and shutter speed combination you want to go for. Really, really nice and works perfectly fine. Please note that the IIIm, so the sister camera, came with a built-in selenium light meter, but this feels quite large in my opinion, especially in comparison to the setup that I have here. And it also comes with the typical disadvantages of the old selenium light meters, which tend to become less accurate over time. And if you have a built-in light meter that is not accurate, of course, that's rather a nuisance than a benefit. The bottom plate features a tripod socket, film release button, and an opening mechanism similar to the one on the Leica M, but here you have, you can turn it to open and then press in to unlock the back, and then that opens up here with a hinge and open up the back. And the top plate only has a shutter release button, automatic frame counter, cold shoe, film, rewind lever, and a beautiful inscription of the camera's name and the serial number, which I personally really like. In general, the design of the camera is very clean and definitely sparks curiosity. It even turns head, and I had 2 occasions in Berlin where other photographers were addressing me, either because they liked the combination of the modern light meter plus the vintage camera, or because they just liked the overall camera and were immediately interested and started a conversation. So overall, a really, really interesting camera. If you don't mind the fixed lens and the EV values, then you get a really, really nice setup, a beautiful quality, and a really nice sharp 50mm lens that we will dive deeper into in a minute. So what about the image quality and the results? When researching the camera online, I was honestly stunned by the kinds of images I found on Instagram, Flickr and other sources. Furthermore, I found some really interesting, raging reviews about the camera. And one reviewer quoted from an original review, and I have to quote that here as well, because I found that so interesting. It's from Pop Photos, What's New in 1958. Quote, "Both Hexanon lenses rank among the very finest lenses available today and exhibit the quality of high-grade interchangeable optics which cost more than the Konica camera complete with carrying case. One of the finest 35s we have ever encountered," unquote. And indeed, the images turned out really nice and have a beautiful vintage feel in my opinion. Even when shot wide open, the Hexanon lens produces great sharpness and contrast with some slight fall off and vignetting towards the corners, but once you stop down to f5.6, this effect completely goes away and you have sharpness across the entire frame. And the bokeh, in my opinion, looks fantastic, and you get beautiful transitions from the in-focus to out-of-focus areas. The color representation is fantastic and brings out the character of the chosen film stock. So in my case here with the slightly overexposed Kodak Gold 200, it just looked fantastic to me, and it kind of accentuated that vintage feel that I wanted to create with these images and that I also expected. Of course, shooting against the sun and direct light sources is not recommendable because the lens is prone to flaring and ghosting. And of course, this can always be used as a creative effect, but in this particular case, I wouldn't recommend it because it's very hard to control in this particular case. You can really feel that Konica didn't cut any corners in the creation process of these lenses, especially here the lens, the 50mm that I was able to test. And you can really feel that it was optimized for this particular camera. And also almost lives up to the Leica Summicron that Konica was aiming for with the Konica IIIa. If you want an early Summicron look and feel that comes with that kind of vintage vibe, and you don't want to break the bank and also don't want to compromise when it comes to sharpness and contrast, then in my opinion the Konica IIIa is an excellent choice. So overall, I was really surprised by these fantastic images that this camera produces. Even until today, I would second what the original review from 1958 said. This is fantastic, and it's very hard to find a similar value proposition. And oftentimes, if you find great lenses, these are significantly more expensive than here the entire camera with all its mechanical quality, beautiful design, and so on. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? I really adore the beautiful, clean design of this camera, and especially the typography here on the top plate. I paired the camera with a Oberwert Colorado strap in dark brown with some green nuances, and personally I think it really fits the Konica IIIa nicely. And I also tracked down an original lens cap featuring the Konica name on it, because the camera originally came without it, and I also looked online for a fitting lens hood. Unfortunately, the so-called Koni hood, which is made of metal, is very hard to find and super expensive as a standalone. So my only recommendation would be, if you are in the market for such a camera, make sure that you get one with ideally the lens cap and potentially even the metal lens hood, so the so-called Koni hood, because otherwise it will be very difficult to get it as a standalone. While the camera is a bit heavy with its 820 grams, it feels quite compact and very similar to a Leica M. What I particularly like is the focusing tab that is kind of built in and attached to the lens. It reminded me of my Leica M6 in combination with the Leica Summicron. And those of you who have seen my 50mm Summicron review know how much I appreciate that focusing tab. The overall design also reminded me a little bit of the Canon P and the Canon rangefinders in general. So these edges here on the sides, a really nice touch in my opinion, and also ergonomically really nice. It feels pretty solid and nice in your hands. The front-facing film advance, interestingly, is quite an advantage for a left-eye shooter like myself. So if you imagine shooting a camera with your left eye, you are bound to remove your head because you want to protect both your forehead plus your right eye when advancing the film. And in this particular case, I can just stay put and use my either left index finger or left thumb to advance the film 2 times using the double stroke mechanism, and then I'm good to go again. And of course, this is a true benefit for somebody being used to always removing their head here. The only thing about this camera that needs some getting used to, of course, is that EV lock feature and the EV dial to change the exposure. And then once you've set the EV value to move around with the aperture, especially because the 1/500th of a second shutter speed needs some extra force and needs to be deliberately chosen. This is also done for convenience purposes because of course it's easier if you switch your EV value to be then able to move in both directions instead of only having the one direction available. So they deliberately chose that the 250th of a second is the highest you can go, and then need some force to choose the other one. It is actually fun to use once you got your hang around it. For me, it took really some time to get used to it, but once I did, I really started to appreciate it. I also felt at first a little bit insecure about the exposures and whether I really got correct exposures. But it turned out a beautiful combination with the Hexanon light meter that I just put on the cold shoe here. It just worked perfectly, and I really started to appreciate the EV values. Some of you shooting Hasselblad cameras, for instance, might already be familiar with that. And then the transition is even easier. Here's the thing. What is so interesting about the camera is that there are even on the market some cameras available that have the EV lock released. So you will find some listings on eBay and other sources, especially for Japanese dealers, that mention that EV lock released or something similar. And here that basically means that they disconnected that mechanical connection, and you would be able to use the aperture ring and the shutter speed ring disconnected from each other, so they are not bound and tied together anymore, but instead you can choose it as you want. And given the fact that this is even available, this only stressed the point that I was trying to make, that there apparently is a small community of collectors and connoisseurs of this camera that is large enough for Japanese dealers and certain manufacturers to move in that direction, to put the effort into this camera to create versions of the camera with the EV lock released. So super interesting from my perspective. If this is a thing to you and this is important to you, that you are not bound to using the EV lock, then there are versions available. And I would even argue historically and until today, this is the only reason why this camera didn't pick up more, because it came with that EV lock feature that was tricky for some people to get their head around and to use it like that. And many just wanted to use a Sunny 16 rule and be completely free in terms of what they chose in terms of shutter speed and aperture. But here you have a version suddenly that you can just use as it is. So if you are like me and primarily a 50mm shooter and always wanted to try a proper rangefinder camera for street shots and similar application, then this camera is definitely worth a try. The 1:1 viewfinder is fantastic. The overall smooth mechanical operation is fantastic. The build quality is great. You get fantastic optical results. So the only thing is that you don't have the versatility that an interchangeable lens system like the Canon rangefinders or the Leica M system would offer to you. But if you don't mind that and you also don't mind the EV lock, then go for it, or go for the more specific EV lock released versions that are slightly more expensive but can also be purchased from Japanese dealers. So overall, a fantastic, really interesting camera. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the Konica IIIa, an interesting alternative to the much better known Leica M3 or Canon P cameras that comes with an EV lock and a fixed lens. These are the only downsides, so to speak. Otherwise, you get an excellent design, a fantastic build quality, a fantastic sharp lens, and overall a really nice value proposition. So quite a camera for the money, and arguably one of the nicest one-to-one viewfinders in any 35mm rangefinder. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.